obtained his PhD in February 25. And actually, the title is very interesting. The title is Interpreting Agrammatism in the Light of Generative Syntax Frameworks, which is something very close to many of our hearts. And this was supervised by Carlo Cecchetto, right?
Yes.
So, yes, great. So it's fantastic to have you, Mauro, and to hear your perspective as a speech and language therapist, because your master's was in speech and language therapy, right? Your first degree was in philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
And PhD in linguistics. So this is a really, really good combination. So we're very happy to have you as a member of the Action anyway, and also to present today. So yes, please start.
I start sharing. Okay, sorry, I should have checked this before. You ask me. Until sorry, I have to quit and reopen because it doesn't allow me to share the screen. I usually don't use Meet. Sorry, I will do very quickly.
So Hannah, can you allow Mauro to share?
Yeah, that option should be available. It's not coming up for you?
Okay, I'm back. I'm so sorry, but it didn't allow me to share the screen.
Okay, I'm just going to check the settings.
No, but it was my fault. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much for asking me to give this presentation. That was also the chance for me to get back to this topic because I studied this topic during my speech language therapy training, and then I worked the first years with children, but then I moved to work with adults and to work on aphasia. So it also was a good way to get back on this topic. And I also noticed that many of the authors that I read during these months to prepare the talk are indeed member of the Action. I think this could be a good opportunity for discussion, and especially maybe in presence in the next meetings. So today I'm going to talk about language disorders and communication needs in children in general, and then I will try to apply this definition to the core topic of our action. So this is the outline. I will give a little bit of a background about this topic. Then I will introduce the definition of speech language impairment, which is indeed the framework that I studied when I did when I studied speech language therapy, and it has been one of the most used framework for studying this field for over 30 years, and many of the person who works in the linguistic, for example, applied linguistic field, relate a lot to this framework. Then I will describe the developmental language disorder definition and the changes from the SLI approach to the DLD approach. And then I will give the definition of communication needs, and I will try to address the relevance of these definitions for our cost action. I hope this could be, I mean, I try to be not very specific, but I hope that this presentation will open up the discussion to see which definition are more relevant to use in our action, and to get feedback from you. So the background, what is language acquisition? So language acquisition, we can say that in children, it occurs spontaneously through exposure to language input and through meaningful interaction. But it is an innate and subconscious process that do not require explicit instruction or explicit teaching. And in this, language is different from literacy, so writing and reading ability, and numeracy, so arithmetic abilities or calculus abilities, which are defined as school-related skills. So they are not acquired by simple exposure. They require explicit instruction and explicit teaching. This view on language acquisition is shared both by the generative tradition. Indeed, one of the father of this approach started describing these ideas, but also from more functionalist approaches to language, like Krashen. So we define that these core language skills are indeed innate according to this approach, but language acquisition needs environmental input to be activated. Most importantly, experimental studies. Sorry, someone has the audio. Okay. Experimental studies showed that indeed language acquisition, some area of language acquisition, some area of language are indeed correlated with the quantity and the quality of the input that they receive. So they are related to environmental factor, for example, with the socioeconomic status of the parents of the children. These areas are mostly vocabulary, narrative skills, and this is also shown for school-related skills. So in a way, we can imagine that there's a core language faculty that is indeed innate and has just to be activated by also very reduced environmental input, but there are other areas of language that are more similar to abilities that are learned explicitly by the children, and these areas of language are more prone to be modulated by environmental factors. And this has been shown in different across languages, so this is also an important information. Another important topic that also defines the generative perspective on these topics is that language acquisition in children is partially, at least partially, independent from the development of other cognitive function. Indeed, we can see this considering the topic of today. So the idea that there's a specific language impairment. So language impairment that do not present deficits in other cognitive function other than language. For example, I don't know, attention, non-verbal intelligence, pragmatic skills, and so on. And there are also syndromes like Williams syndrome that is characterized, on the contrary, by low IQ, so low intelligence, formal intelligence level, but relatively preserved language abilities, especially grammar. So we can see that there's a double dissociation between cognitive function, and this is even more evident in adults with acquired language disorders, where there's a focal lesion in the brain. We can really differentiate the different cognitive function, and language appear as an isolated function. However, we can once again, we cannot imagine language as isolated by the from the other cognitive function. For example, it has interfaces with the cognition, the general cognition, and the sensory motor system to provide well, the reasoning that is expressed with language, and to guarantee the input and the output of the language message. So indeed, these faculties are partially related. And also this view is challenged by opposing views, so opposing approaches to language acquisition, for example, constructivism and usage-based theories, according to which language development is driven indeed by general cognition and social interactions. Another interesting parallelism is between language and communication. This is to define, again, the perspective that, in a way, is shared by most of the linguists of the action. The idea is that while language indeed serves as our primary means of communication, the evidence suggests that its development might be independent from its communicative function. And this has to be intended both in evolution, so phylogenetically, as development of the human language function, and also in the individual development, so ontogenetically. And once again, there's clinical evidence in support to this idea. Again, we have specific language disorders with preserved communication abilities, both in children, but also in adults with acquired language disorders like aphasia, that in some cases of aphasia have completely preserved communication intention and communication, non-verbal communication abilities, but they have a very specific language deficit, sometimes also only in specific area of language proficiency. And also, we see that there are some children, for example, some children with autism or some children with pragmatic disorders that have preserved core language abilities, but impair pragmatic, so impair communication abilities. And once again, the same approaches that are opposing this view that suggests that language evolution, both as an evolutionary approach and with a developmental, so individual approach, are driven by communication and social needs, and indeed by social interaction. So, which are today's question? Some children, indeed, exhibit atypical language development, which may affect their communication and social skill, and may be also related with other cognitive developmental conditions. But how we can define and classify this population, keeping in mind all this background that I just described, and what criteria should be used to determine the inclusion and exclusion criteria for diagnostic purposes. And as a further question, what are the implications of the choices in terms of definition and classification and inclusion and exclusion criteria for the scientific research, for the clinical practice, and for societal support? This topic has a long history because the first studies on language acquisition and language disorder especially started in the beginning of the 19th century. And here is just a schematic representation drawn by this article by Riley in 2014, just a historical representation of the different terms that has been used until the term specific language impairment, that is the first one that I will analyze in detail. What we can see is that in the first phase until, let's say, the 50s of the 19th century, the terms really resemble the research on aphasia, on acquired language disorders. And with the development of this generative approach that has had a huge impact on the psycholinguistic and the neurolinguistic research, especially from the 60s on. We can see that the terminology resembles more this idea of developmental language impairment, specific language impairment, developmental language disorders. So really focused of language as an abstract mental faculty, not as a product of some specific lesion in the brain. Okay.
Crte-si. Puno ti hvala.
So let's move on to the definition of specific language impairment. The definition was first proposed in the 80s by Leonard. And the underlying idea is to isolate a pure language disorder, developmental language disorder, in line with the idea that language development is specific and independent from other cognitive function and from the environment in the way that I described a few moments ago. And that's why this definition had an important perspective brought an important perspective for the linguistic and the psycholinguistic research on these topics, because it allows indeed the identification of a homogeneous population without the presence of co-occurring condition that might confound the results. So if we are specific in isolate pure cases of pure language disorders, we will have a more homogeneous group that will be more informative from a linguistic point of view. This is a general idea for the research. And also this framework reflects the idea that there's a specific neurobiological etiology in the understanding of the disorders versus a multifactorial hypothesis. So it's really linked to the biology of the child that display specific language impairment. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this definition is important because it shaped the clinical practice and also the psycholinguistic research on this topic for approximately 30 years. And although the label does not appear explicitly in the ICD, so the International Classification of Diseases, number 10, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for mental disabilities, number 4, the underlying ideas for the definition of this disorder are indeed included in the inclusion and exclusion criteria presented by these manuals. So let's see this a little bit in detail. Okay, this is the ICD-10. The label is disorder of psychological. The area is the disorders of psychological development, and the labels that correspond to specific language impairment are expressive language disorder and receptive language disorder. These are the codes. So in the slide, you can see the definition. What I want to underline is that the point that is marked in red states that to have a specific developmental disorder, the child's ability to use, in this case, expressive spoken language, because we are talking about the expressive language disorders, has to be below the appropriate level for his or her mental age. So the reference is the discrepancy with the mental age, so the intelligence level. And the same goes for the receptive language disorder. In this case, we are talking about the understanding of language, not the production of language, but the definition doesn't change. So the criteria is that this linguistic performance level has to be below the appropriate level for his or her mental age. As for the DSM-4, the diagnostic criteria for expressive language disorder are again defined in terms of discrepancy with the nonverbal intellectual capacity. And another element that is marked in the DSM-4 is the fact that this difficulty with expressive language has to interfere with the academic or occupational achievement or with social communication. So there has to be an impact in the academic achievement and in the daily living. And the same goes, in this case, is not a receptive language disorder, but receptive expressive language disorder, with the idea that if there is a receptive deficit, this will also be represented in the expressive language abilities. And once again, the important element is the difference with the nonverbal intellectual capacity and the impact on academic achievements and social communication. So to summarize, which are the definition and the exclusion criteria that are fundamental for the framework of the specific language impairment? So the SLI is defined as a developmental language disorder characterized by significant difficulties in language skills, so deficits in expressive and or receptive language compared to age expectation. And the exclusion criteria are the performance or nonverbal IQ below the normal range, so usually below 85 points, the presence of hearing loss, the presence of other neurological condition, for example, cerebral palsy or epilepsy, structural, so anatomical and motor impairments, other pervasive developmental disorders, for example, autism, and environmental deprivation or lack of exposure to language. So as you can see, these exclusion criteria really focus on the fact that the language disorder has to be pure, so it cannot be justified by other possible etiologies. So they cannot be justified by a deficit in cognitive functioning, pragmatic abilities, hearing loss, or so sensory deprivation, structural and motor impairments, so motor impairment, motor difficulties, and by environmental factors. This research, the research on these topics, as I mentioned before, it has been very interesting from the linguistic point of view because allowed to identify specific linguistic markers for this type of disorders. For example, several studies identified language-specific, so different for each language of the world, language-specific linguistic markers which are particularly sensitive for the identification of children with SLI. The presence of these linguistic markers allow to distinguish SLI from other conditions that might cause language or communication difficulties or delay. So we can have children that present overall language deficit due to other factors, environmental, cognitive impairments and stuff like that. But these linguistic markers allow to identify the children that are that present specifically this pure language impairment. And this fact also underlined the relevance of the formal linguistic input to research for studying developmental disorders. A few examples of these, for example, the production of verb tense inflection, so auxiliaries, and for example, the S for the third singular plural, or the ED for the past in English, and also non-word repetition in English, and clitic pronouns in Italian. I will give you just a brief examples. For verb tense inflection, Rice and Wechsler showed that they compared the performance of three groups of children: one group with specific language impairment, SLI, one group of children that has the same mean length of utterance, which is an indirect measure of syntactic complexity of the group with SLI, and the third group of age-match children. And only the SLI group showed a specific impairment for verb tense morphology. So even with children, younger children with comparable with a comparable measure of syntactic complexity, still only the children with a specific language impairment showed significant deficit in this specific language phenomenon, which is verb tense inflection. And the same has been shown for clitic pronouns in Italians, which are in the example, Maria la vede, the underline la corresponds to the pronoun her. In the English version, Maria sees her. But in this case, this pronoun is does not have an accent and precedes the verb. And we have the optionality of have this pronoun or the full pronoun that corresponds to her, which is lei. But in some contexts, we should use the tonic pronoun, so lei, and some contexts we have to use the clitic pronoun la. Children with specific language impairment in Italian show a specific deficit with the production of this type of structure. In particular, they tend to omit this clitic pronoun or to use them inappropriately, so without the right gender or number agreement with the referent. Okay. Now we move to the other framework, which is called the developmental language disorder, so a change of definition. Let's see why, first of all, why there was this necessity for a change from the SLI to the DLD perspective. Since around 2012, there has been an increasing debate regarding the terminology and the diagnostic criteria for SLI. In particular, the criticism focused on the fact that SLI is a confusing terminology, but mostly for the fact that the exclusion criteria for SLI were considered too rigid. In particular, the objections to the SLI terminology and diagnostic criteria underline that these criteria fail to capture the multifactorial nature of the disorder that includes both biological and environmental risk factors. These rigid and restrictive exclusion criteria exclude many children who could indeed benefit from targeted intervention. So they are too restrictive in doing the diagnosis. The two main inputs for this discussion and also for my presentation are the special issue of the International Journal of Language and Communication Disorder on this topic, published in 2014, and the two papers that were the output of the Catalyze consensus study. The two papers were published in 2016 and 2017 respectively. You have all the references in the slides. I will present you mixing the results of the Catalyze paper, the paper that presented the results of the Catalyze study, and one other paper from the special issue that I mentioned before. The paper presents several statements that describe the new perspective that expert on the topic of developmental language disorder propose for analyzing this area. The first statement of the Catalyzed Consensus study is that it's important that those working in the field of children language problems use consistent terminology. And this, I put this because it's a reminder also for us, since in a way we work on this topic, and so we should share a consistent terminology on this. The second and the third statement define language disorder as the presence of language problems that are persistent in time. So the emphasis is on the fact that these disorders are persistent and that they impact on social interaction and educational progress. While in statements 6 and 7, they state that language disorder, in contrast with the SLI definition, can be associated with other biological condition, and in this case, we should call this condition language disorder associated with Down syndrome, or language disorder associated with autism spectrum disorder, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, sorry, there's a typo in the slide. This is defined developmental language disorder. So when the language disorder is not associated with another defined condition, we should define this disorder as DLD, developmental language disorder. And also the rest of the Catalyzed article and the other papers in the special issue present statement against the use of exclusionary criteria for the diagnosis. In particular, the statement 8 is a statement against the use of the performance IQ cutoff for the diagnosis. In particular, a child with language disorder may have a low level of nonverbal ability, and this does not preclude the diagnosis of DLD. The results of this, the reason for this is derived by reviews of previous studies of SLI and non-specific language impairment in case of low performance IQ. And the meta-analysis of these studies showed that children with SLI have significantly higher mean language score and higher non-verbal scores than children with non-SLI, non-specific SLI with low performance IQ. So these two groups simply differ in terms of severity, but they are a continuum. They do not differ in the nature of the disorder, in the phenotypical presentation of the disorder. So they has to be considered as variation within the same group, and so we should remove this exclusion criteria. The same goes for other developmental disorders. Statement 9 state that other impairment in cognitive, sensory, motor, or behavioral domain can co-occur with DLD, may affect pattern of impairment and response to intervention, but the causal relation to language is unclear, so they cannot be considered as exclusion criteria for DLD, and cannot be considered as the primary cause for the language disorder, interpreting this disorder as secondary to the other co-occurring condition. Example of these conditions are attentional problem like ADHD, motor problems like coordination disorder, literacy disorders, so reading and spelling problems, speech problems, and behavioral and emotional disorders. Another important change in the perspective with DLD is the fact that risk factors for the development of DLD are both the biological and the environmental ones. So they are both considered as statistically associated with the language disorder, but again, the causal relationship is unclear or partial. So we cannot restrict the risk factor for language disorder to the biological one, but also the environmental one could play a role in the modulation of the phenotype. And so environmental deprivation, social disadvantage cannot be taken as an exclusion criteria. Indeed, this choice in SLI is considered to have at least two drawbacks. First of all, it overlooks the possibility that environmental factor may actually genuinely contribute to the risk of developing DLD, genuine DLD. And also this had led in the past to the underrepresentation of children from low socioeconomic backgrounds in the research on language disorders because they were excluded as exclusion criteria. Okay, the other element also linked with the environmental factor is bilingualism. Bilingual children that are acquired an L2 in the target country, that come from a different country, for example, are a child of immigrant, they're exposed to a certain language, and that they start to learn to acquire the language of the society, may indeed show a language performance in both languages, but especially in the language of the society, that appears weaker than the one of their monolingual peers. However, this fact alone cannot indicate the presence of the developmental language disorder or specific language impairment. That's why bilingual children were excluded by, so there has to be carefully evaluated for a diagnosis of a specific language impairment. In the DLD framework, the authors explicitly say that the presence of bilingualism cannot rule out the possibility that bilingual children may have a DLD. So bilingualism cannot be considered an exclusion criterion for diagnosis, and this is even more important in a context which is increasingly multilingual and multicultural, and in which new tools for language assessment are developed specifically for the bilingual population and are continuously improving. As we can see in the following slide, this definition this change of perspective had an impact also in diagnostic criteria. So the ICD-11, which is the following one from the one I presented, incorporate the idea of the DLD definition. First of all, because the term that is used from ICD-12 is developmental language disorder. And the inclusion criteria, so the fact that is underlined in the presentation of this disorder is the fact that the deficit in the acquisition, understanding, and production or use of language is persistent. So the fact that it's persistent is the most striking characteristic. And then as for the exclusion criteria, we don't have exactly the exclusion criteria, but in the description of the disorder, we read that language ability are markedly below what we would expect for the age, not the mental age. So the reference is just the chronological age, not the mental age. The IQ cutoff has been deleted. And even in the ICD, the stress is on the impact, the social and communication functional impact. We can also see that the discrepancy between verbal and nonverbal ability can be present in DLD, but is not a requirement for the diagnosis. This is even more explicit. And it's interesting to notice that in comparison with developmental language disorder, which has a definitory point that states the limitation are not attributable to external factors such as economic or environmental disadvantage or lack of access to educational opportunities. In the case of developmental language disorder, this statement is not present in the ICD, so there's no such exclusion criterion. And the same goes for the DSM, the fifth, that use the terminology language disorder, and once again removed the cutoff for the nonverbal IQ, and stressed the presence of persistent difficulty as first element for the definition. Okay, so summarizing, which are the key changes from SLI to DLD? The removal of nonverbal IQ cutoffs, the acknowledgement of co-occurring condition, and the recognition of environmental factor as risk factor alongside the biological factors. There's also an additional statement in the Catalyze paper that says that DLD is a heterogeneous category that encompasses a wide range of problems. Nevertheless, it can be useful for clinicians to pinpoint the principal area for intervention, and most importantly for us, researchers may decide to focus on children with specific characteristics to define more homogeneous samples for study. So, because the first time that I read the new definition of DLD, I thought, okay, it's very important from a societal point of view because we can diagnose much more children and we can provide service to much more children that has these needs. But on the other side, I was worried about the fact that all the interesting linguistic and psycholinguistic research on this topic would have been not so rigorous anymore, because we wouldn't have a category to describe so precisely the population. But this is also accounted in the Catalyze framework, because they added this statement that explicitly say that for research purposes we can focus on specific characteristics, and this as a relevant for the development of this field. I will conclude with the definition of communication needs. This has a shift in perspective because this is not a diagnostic category. The term communication need of speech, language, and communication needs refers to all children with difficulties of limitation in communication, regardless of the diagnosis or the underlying cause. This label, this framework, allows the inclusion of children that do not have a diagnosis but experience in the daily life difficulties, even if they are temporary, and even if they're purely due to environmental and contextual factors. The introduction of these terms provide a very useful tool in the educational and social context, because it allows the identification by some professionals, especially educators and teachers, the identification of children with specific needs, even without a medical diagnostic process. For example, in Italy, there's this tool called BES, Bisogni Educativi Speciali, Special Educational Needs, that represent a school level and flexible and inclusive framework designed to support students and support the teacher to identify the person that are that can benefit from a specific intervention that is purely educational. So in this case, not the classification is not the goal of this perspective, but indeed the profile, the communication profile, identification of the communication profile and the communication functioning, and the personal goal of the child. And so the aim is also to address social and educational determinants to identify and possibly reduce the communication barrier. So it's a practical tool, a pragmatic tool. As I said before, there are several conditions that can be described as speech language communication needs: children with DLD, speech sound disorders, language disability, intellectual disability, neurological condition, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and other neurodevelopmental disorders, deaf children and children with hearing loss or other sensory deficits, bilingual, multilingual, and L2 learning children, socially disadvantaged children, and socially disadvantaged children. This term is also proposed in the Catalyze as a tool, not for medical purposes, but for pedagogical purposes. And in the slide, you can see a representation, a Venn diagram of the possible disorders and how can they be defined. So there are a subset of DLD, developmental language disorder, the wider set of language disorder, the speech sound disorders that somehow presented in superposition with two sets, and the wider set of speech language communication needs that includes several other conditions. This terminology allows also more inclusivity in social research, because as I said before, prior to the introduction of this framework, children without a formal diagnosis but presenting communication difficulties were often underrepresented or excluded or underestimated in social and educational research. So the use of this category can indeed facilitate a more inclusive and representative studies and to better capture the needs of the population, so the children with special communication needs. And given the goals of our cost action, I would say that this framework and this terminology is best suited to support our work. So it is the most specific for the needs that we have, and maybe we should use this terminology for the communication among professionals from different fields. But indeed, do we need more detail? Could be my questions for you are: can we identify, can this question be possible topics for our cost action or for future development of this action? So can we identify children with more specific DLD within the broader population of youth in conflict with the law who present communication needs? In this, I cannot provide even a suggestion because I'm not an expert in evaluating children in this context, but I would like to hear from you about this. Can we profile children with DLD in conflict with the law to distinguish those that has a kind of a primary or intrinsic language impairments, more in the sense of the SLI framework? And do the communication needs of children with DLD differ significantly for those of children who do not meet the diagnostic criteria for DLD? So these are the open questions that I want to leave for you. Just take on message to wrap it up. Pay attention to the shift in the framework for SLI and DLD, especially when reviewing the literature. And this is a reminder for us, member of the working group 1 that are currently working on a review of the literature on these topics. And also terminology matters. Choosing the right terminology to communicate among us help us to avoid misunderstanding and the aims of our investigation within the action. Well, these are the references, and thank you all for your attention. I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Maro. This was fantastic. So relevant to our action. You have also specific guidelines for us, which is amazing. And you also have questions for us to all work on together. So brilliant. Let's open the floor to the questions that people will have about your talk. And then maybe other people can enter the discussion about the questions that you pose on your last slides, which are really relevant. Okay, so I saw Katerina's, I think Katerina raised her hand. And Maria.
Maria.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't. It was a mistake. I was
Okay.
trying to clap my hands and I raised also my
Okay.
hands. So it
Let's
was
start with Maria then. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks, Maro. Quick question, and sorry if I missed it, but if I remember well, the Catalyze study was mainly done drawing from English-speaking countries.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And in your experience, what has the take of these in others? Because you have done your research in different countries. So what is in your experience, the views from other people?
I don't have an extensive knowledge, but to prepare this talk, I asked a few persons that work in this field, and they told me that at least in Germany and in Italy, the consensus conferences that have been done recently, in more recent year from the Catalyze, basically included all the statement of the Catalyze output. So the tendency is that. And also the fact that these criteria has been used for the ICD and the DSM manuals, it basically says that this is the new tendency, at least in the clinical framework, in the clinical setting.
Yeah, because there hasn't been a pushback, right? I mean, I haven't heard of, I don't know. I don't know if anyone else.
I heard from people that work in the border between linguistics and speech language therapy, or not speech language therapy, but developmental disorders, that the idea, for example, of removing the cutoff for the nonverbal intelligence is really appreciated, because the data really suggests that that makes no sense to distinguish the two groups as two different nosological groups, but in research you can simply add as a covariate of your model, when you do the analysis, the QI score, and then it's very useful to have a single category for both people, for both groups. Okay.
Alfonso, thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to add that there is the German, they already did this consensus, and we have this publication with Spanish-speaking countries on the consensus of the Catalyze criteria. We did our first two publications. So it was one first explaining what is the framework, the new framework, and then we started with a questionnaire with different researchers and specialists from different countries speaking Spanish all over the world. And now I know we are going through the second round of Delphi in order to Delphi study. So I can tell from the last round that many of the big important statements have been agreed, because the second round is just going into very specific details to reach agreement. But there were like other more like basics that it is pushing towards, like all Spanish-speaking countries are going through towards the model of the Catalyze, and it's applied to that. I just wanted to add that information.
Okay, Maria.
Can I ask a follow-up? And what professionals are included in that study? Because one, I mean, the big one of the, I don't know if objections, but what bothered me about the Delphi study initial was that I didn't see linguists involved. right? So, and that I found a big problem. I mean, to be discussing the change of terminology when the first label has been proposed and used and being the basis of a very important body of work, without having those professionals involved, I think it was a problem for that study. I mean, I always saw it as a flaw. And how are you doing it in the Spanish one?
So I just must say that I was an author on the first kind of exploration, and now I'm not an author, I'm a participant. So for the Delphi study, so the details of who is doing the Delphi study, I don't know, but I could refer you to the researchers. So
Yeah, because
actually,
I want to know if there are
actually,
linguists.
Ürens Andreu, but the criteria that I think is that you've been working at some point, or you've been like developing research on that thing, on that area. So I think that was the criteria. I don't think there was a specific exclusion if you are a linguist that not be included. I don't think so. So I don't, but I truly don't know. I cannot solve that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Carla, thank you.
No.
We can't hear you.
Now you can, I guess.
Yes,
Yes.
now we can.
Okay. Now, when Maria asked her question, maybe this is not what she had in mind, but I thought she was asking about the fact that in some languages that are, for example, morphologically richer, formal criteria for SLI, okay, might be easier to find. Like, I mean, in English, okay, there is some morphology that's already revealing, but for example, there was a huge amount of work on clitics. Clitics are, and in English you don't have clitics. So I wonder whether the fact that for this trend started in a largely English-based group, kind of was influenced by the characteristic of a language. Okay, so maybe in English, really SLI as a notion is a bit more difficult to define than in our languages. So this is my personal reaction. And the second thing that came from your talk is that I see how social needs motivated. So you insisted on that. I didn't think about that before. Namely, there were people that were excluded from the criteria, so didn't have support. Okay.
Yes.
So it's
This-
like, a social factor that impacted on a scientific decision.
Yeah, this is
which
something.
is kind of interesting, and I fully understand. But on the other hand, it's a bit, I don't know, it worries me a
Yes.
bit.
Yes, this also my sorry, Alfonso, if I just reply really quickly, because it's also one thing that kind of preoccupied me, because the more, I mean, the more strict criteria that remains in DLD, as far as I understand, is the fact that the disturb is permanent. But in my clinical experience, the fact of having the possibility of assess for a long time a single child and to see if the disturb is indeed persistent in time is not so easy. So the tendency is to give the diagnosis right away. And okay, you provide a service to a person, a support to a person, which is very good. But on the other side, you make the numbers of people with the diagnosis explode. And personally, I have the impression that what are we evaluating? Like you end up having 20% of people in one classroom with some sort of DLD or language disability diagnosis, and I don't think, I mean, as maybe it's true that the biological situation changed so rapidly in the last years, but I seriously doubt that. So I don't know.
Okay, we had Alfonso reacting to this. Be nice to open the floor to other people as well from other countries before
Sure.
people have to leave. But thank you so much for reacting to this, Alfonso.
Oh, no, it's other people can speak before in advance if they want to.
No, you can carry on, and then after you is Maria, and then we'll see if
It's
there's
like,
anyone else.
yeah. So yeah, I have like the catalyzed movement. I think it opened this thing, this problem, and how research at a certain point, when I was a clinician and I was doing, and I had to do the diagnosis, I was so strict with the SLI criteria. And it was like, this is the only box. And then you try the other things that were not within that box, then it was very difficult to deal with. And I think that, and that's a movement that is going to ASD and other diagnosis criteria on having a bigger umbrella that helps telling what are the difficulties, the functionalities that are those that are needed, those that are already working correctly. And that's something like the main point and what is relevant. Then I agree with Maro a lot on that we need to advance our assessment protocols and things and methods on how to measure how this permanency, how persistency is and can be assessed, and that's why I think research community in a language evaluation is now focusing a lot on dynamic assessment, because it's giving you a short measure on what is the learning capability of language, and that may be sensitive to that part. So that's one thing I wanted to add. Then the other thing that from my experience and this now Delphi and talking to other people, it is not, and I think it's very relevant what Carlo was saying, depending on the language, it might be, but I think what is more or less within the field that there is not so much agreement. So let's say, so if there is a language that has a lot of clitics or syntactic things and they have difficulties, and that's going to be easily accepted as something that is belonging to developmental language disorder. You are just going to say, this is something specific for my language. I don't think that's going to be like a big, I mean, I don't say that we don't need to study it. Of course, we need to study it for every language, but that's the community is going to accept. I think the framework that is like kind of floppy and there's not so much consensus is in pragmatics. Yeah. So that's the area that, and what are the conceptions of pragmatics, whether we include it in the DLD or not. The catalyze includes pragmatics within, and that's actually the point that actually I think is like kind of whether my conception and my theoretical framework is more linguistic pragmatics or pragmatic that is also including more socio-communicative abilities or not. And there is the pragmatic world is quite open, as you know, and that's at the end. To me, I think those are theoretical relevant questions, but when we translate that to clinical population, we need to be very aware of what we write in our papers, because those messages arrive to clinicians. And we need to say, if they find a difficulty in that area, then you need to intervene, or you need to see something or do something, not saying, no, we are not going to do anything because that's not language, or because that's, I mean, I truly don't mind. If I want to be open, I truly don't mind if you've considered pragmatics within language or not, or whatever. But if you find you have difficulties, then you need to intervene it and do something. So that was my message that I wanted to say.
Okay, so some reactions in the chat, and also Maria Garafa has a question. Can I just read this from Jan de Jong? Maria, you mentioned that Catalyze lacked linguistic input. If I do not misinterpret what you said, just check the Catalyze 2 consortium to confirm my own impressions. The consortium did include several, in brackets, clinical linguists. Okay, so well, that's open to interpretation how much linguistics there was there. Okay, Maria Garafa.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. First of all, Mauro, thank you very much. Amazing to have all this summary and different criteria for clinicians, of course, for linguist background, but try to point to the essential dilemma about DLD that is not recognized in many countries at all. as a disability, because first of all, it depends on which model of disability a country has. We come from, we know that global health can have huge differences, that in some countries, even autism can be a struggle. I mean, I'm not an expert on that. It is starting now with WHO, but things like DLD are really subtle, and in many countries are not considered a priority at all. So I think we have to start potentially also from a more general consideration. I love the questions. I think I will potentially would like to have more time to think of the questions that Mauro has extracted from the presentation. I don't know, Maria Alex, if you can circulate them to the working groups and maybe for us to produce some sort of reflections. Because
everything
really
will be, this is being recorded and it will be on the website in the next week or so, but we can also share the slides from Mauro.
Yeah, I think we should elaborate a task around them because they are very, very extremely interesting. About the comments we're discussing now about linguistics, I think Mauro started with a very general introduction about what language acquisition is, mentioning, if I'm right, 3 main ingredients, the cognition, the exposure, and maybe these 2 are activating language. I'm not sure where this third ingredient that is actually the core part we're talking about is. There is a lot of research on cognition, a lot of research that I guess the nonverbal intelligence come from there, yes or no, including, excluding, for including more children. How can we linguists define a little bit better the social exposure, social environmental, sorry, that was the word, needs that we need to acquire specifically? I don't know, clitics, if that was the thing, or a little bit more specifically, because at the moment, linguistic is not in the discussion of DLD, not as much, apart from a niche of people working on clinical markers. Can we contribute to this? Okay, these kids have a lack of exposure, for example, socioeconomic factors, they can't do these specific structures. What is the ingredient for them to have a rich, potentially complete exposure? Is it language itself? So they need more exposure of a richer environment. So we talk, and then I finish with that. We have a population of kids that potentially have a problem on exposure. What kind of intervention can we think about? So for me, this is always a big gap where linguistics sometimes I think does not contribute much in giving, very, even some advice, general advice. There is a lot on speech acts, for example, now, a lot of debating, discussing and communication, promoting children and communicate. Where is the linguistic? There is a lot of linguistics there, we know. Can we pair with this sort of pedagogical tools with some linguistics there, and how? That's my...
Okay. Thank you. I mean, this is a fantastic, the discussion generated is amazing, but we have to kind of wrap up soon. Does anybody else want to kind of give a final remark? Does anybody else wants to say something very quickly? But this is, Mauro, thank you. You have raised a lot of really important questions here, so we're very grateful.
Thank you.
Any other comments or thoughts? Or no? Everybody's thanking. People had to leave, so okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here today with us. And just a reminder, for the 18th of June, Hannah has sent out an invite. There's going to be a webinar, a hybrid workshop hosted by University of Greenwich. So please check your emails for that. Lovely seeing everyone. Thank you, Hannah, for organizing.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Mauro.
Bye.